Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. McMorris Rodgers, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Koblitz, the United States scored 9 out of 10 on dual-use research governance, while China scored 0. That's obviously concerning given the dual-use research on pathogens as obvious military applications. Can you explain what factors led to the differences in those scores?
Certainly. So the United States scored, I think, 5 out of 10 because our primary mode of oversight is through the NIH review of dual-use research and through the DIRC policy and through the P3CO framework. And so, and the United States also does awareness building activities through the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. And we have local stakeholder groups like the American Society for Microbiology that have codes of conduct and codes of ethics that govern the research being done by their scientists. So those factors are what gave the U.S. the score it got for dual-use research oversight, which is better than most countries, but still not a perfect score by any means. In contrast, China doesn't have in place now any meaningful oversight of dual-use research. There is on the books a biosecurity law from 2020 that calls for the development of such a system within China, but those regulations have not yet been promulgated within China, and so there's no active oversight over the research that's being done to monitor and oversee it and whether or not it is poses any dual-use risks or not. So I do hope that that will be forthcoming in the near future, and we will certainly update our report when we do it next if China and the U.S. make progress in those areas.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Dr. Casagrande, for risky research involving dangerous pathogens, why is more transparency about biosafety standards and communicating best biosafety practices important?
Thank you for the question. The communication of best practices is important because each lab has has thought leaders who are carefully considering the risks that they face, and has implemented particular mitigations to address all those risks and make them as minimal as possible. This is often due to the creative thought and careful effort of these individuals, and though it's created to address risks that they've found personally in their laboratories, those same mitigations could be beneficial in many, many institutions, but people don't think of sharing those innovations and best practices. So understanding those and communicating those would enable everyone to benefit from them instead of reinventing them over and over again. It would be a much more efficient use of labor.
Thank you. Would you speak to how it may benefit the public, more transparency and communication?
Sure. The sharing of these best practices would benefit the public by, one, making sure our tax dollars are best spent on doing the actual research as opposed to mitigating the risks of the research, and two, making labs across the United States safer without actually having to do trainings or anything like that. It would be just communicating all the great work that's already been done inside these containment labs.
Would you give us your thoughts on what aspects of lab operations, lab safety could be made more transparent?
Could be made more transparent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, specific, like what aspects of the operations?
Sure. Well, I think the public, as was mentioned on this panel, I don't think the public appreciates the great effort that is going on already, how much effort is spent on emergency response protocols, how much effort is spent on medical surveillance, how much effort is spent on, if there is an exposure, what those workers do. In addition to all of the engineering controls and equipment that's spent. People often conflate the concept of an incident in the lab to an outbreak. And in fact, there's an incident that could occur, and the vast majority of those are mitigated by the equipment and procedures in place and don't result in an infection. But if an infection were to occur, there's a lot of procedures in place to isolate the worker and monitor them so that they don't necessarily infect anyone else. So only a very tiny minority of workplace infections lead to secondary infections. And so I think because there is a lack of awareness on all the different measures that exist inside U.S. laboratories, I think people often think that you start at spilling a flask and then instantly you have a pandemic. And there's many, many steps in between those two that are mitigated by all the measures already in place.
So it sounds like the increased transparency could play a role in actually improving lab safety also.
Yes, especially the public's perception of lab safety. I don't think there's a good appreciation of all the efforts that are currently in place.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all again for being here. I yield back.
Janella yields back, now recognizes